In 1958, in Needles, California, one of the hottest towns in America, where the desert air came off the sand at 120 degrees and the Route 66 traffic crawled through nose to tail, there was a mechanic who could cure an overheating engine that had beaten every shop for 100 miles. Cars limped and boiling, steam pouring from the hood, drivers half panicked in that furnace heat. He would lay a hand on the radiator, listen, and know. He read a cooling system the way a doctor reads a fever, and he understood one thing the frightened drivers did not. An engine almost never makes too much heat. It fails to move the heat it makes. That idea is number one. But it began with something as simple as laying a flat hand across a radiator, and that is number 20. Here is the truth the whole trade was built on. A cooling system has one job: to carry the fire's heat out of the engine and hand it to the air, and everything in it is a link in that one chain. The coolant carries the heat to the radiator hands it to the air, the pump keeps it flowing, the fan keeps the air moving, and the pressure cap holds it together and lifts the boiling point so the coolant works without turning to steam. When an engine overheats, it is almost never because it made too much heat. It is because one link broke and the heat stopped moving. Find the broken link and you have cured the fever. That is the whole art, and the thing the sealed, computer-watched systems of today quietly let a generation of shops forget. Number 15 is the collapsing radiator hose that sucks itself flat at speed and tells you exactly where the trouble hides, a thing almost no one looks for anymore. Number 10 is the summer fix half the country believed in, pulling the thermostat out. That actually makes an engine run hotter, not cooler. And number 1 is the master principle every one of these tricks is only a piece of. The reason that desert mechanic could cure a fever no one else could read. None of these were guesses. They were the craft of a man who understood heat and flow and pressure in a place where getting it wrong left a family stranded in 120-degree heat. Hit that subscribe button and let us count down the 20 genius cooling system tricks 1958 mechanics used that most modern shops have forgotten. Number 20, reading the radiator with a flat hand. The cold spots that mapped the clog. With the engine warm, you laid a flat hand across the face of the radiator, feeling for cold patches. A radiator sheds heat evenly when coolant flows through every tube, so a cold spot with hot all around it meant a plugged tube, a dead channel carrying no heat away. A mechanic in 1958 read a radiator by hand before he trusted any gauge, because a clogged core runs cold where its tubes are plugged while the engine cooks, so the cold patch told him the radiator was choking. The Needles mechanic could map a dying radiator with his palm before another man found his tools. The gauge said hot. His hand said where. Number 19. The garden hose flow test. The full stream that proved the core was clear. You pulled the radiator, turned it over, and ran a garden hose into the outlet, watching what came out the far end. A healthy core passed the full flow, a strong stream out as fast as it went in. A clogged one dribbled and backed up, its tubes silted half shut by the crud of years. A mechanic in 1958 flow-tested a suspect radiator with a hose because the flow it passes measures how open its tubes are, and a core that backs up will never pass enough coolant to cool an engine. The Needles mechanic trusted the hose over any man's opinion, his own included. Water in, water out. The radiator passed the test, or it did not. Number 18. Reverse flushing the crud out, pushing the silt back the way it came. When a system was silted but not dead, you reverse flushed it, running water backward through the block and radiator to break the scale loose and push it out the way it came in. Years of hard water left a system lined with sediment that insulated the metal and choked the tubes, and a reverse flush scoured out what a drain and fill left behind. A mechanic in 1958 reverse flushed a crusty system before condemning the radiator because sediment settles in the direction of normal flow, so forcing water backward dislodges, deposits a forward flush, only packs tighter, and half the time the crud, not the core, was the enemy. The needles mechanic flushed a system until the water ran clear, then once more. The rust did not leave on its own. He sent it back out the door, it came in. Number 17. Testing the thermostat in a pan of hot water. Watching the valve that ruled the flow. You dropped the thermostat into a pan of water on a hot plate with a thermometer beside it, and watched. A good one stayed shut until the water reached its rated heat, then opened clean and full. A bad one hung jammed shut, or half open, or opened late and lazy, strangling the coolant and cooking the engine in minutes. A mechanic in 1958 boiled a suspect thermostat before he blamed anything larger because it opens at a set temperature to let coolant reach the radiator, so one stuck closed would overheat the finest engine built. The needles mechanic kept a pan and thermometer on the bench for this. The thermostat was small and cheap. It could also strangle an engine.
Before we go on, I made something special for you. A guide for men like us, who still believe a man should be able to keep his own car running. It's the Forgotten Mechanic's Handbook, the old-fashioned car repair secrets our grandfathers used to fix any engine and keep it running for decades. But these skills are disappearing fast, and once they're gone for good. Don't pay another mechanic ever again. Scan the QR code on screen or click the link below. Go ahead, I'll wait right here.
Number 16. Reading the two hoses by hand. The heat that told him where the flow had stopped. With the engine warming, you laid a hand on the upper radiator hose and then the lower, feeling for the heat to arrive. Both cool with the engine hot meant no circulation, a stuck thermostat or trapped air. Upper hot but lower cold meant the radiator or its flow had failed. The hoses told you which link had broken. A mechanic in 1958 read the hoses by touch because coolant leaves through the upper and returns cooled through the lower, so the temperature of each revealed whether the system was flowing, blocked, or failing. The needles mechanic diagnosed half his overheating cars with two hoses and his own two hands. The heat traveled the chain until it hit the broken link and stopped. He felt for the stop. Number 15, catching the collapsing hose at speed, the soft link that sucked itself flat. You watched the lower radiator hose while a helper revved the engine because one that sucked itself flat was pointing at a hidden restriction. The pump pulls hard on that hose, and if the radiator is clogged or the hose's inner spring has failed, the suction collapses it shut, choking the flow exactly when the engine needs it most. A mechanic in 1958 knew a collapsing hose was a symptom, not just a bad hose, because the collapse comes from a vacuum condition, a clog or a failed internal spring that lets the pump's suction pull it shut, pointing to a restriction the driver could not see. The needles mechanic replaced the hose, then hunted the clog that had killed it. The hose did not fail on its own. Something downstream was strangling it, and it only showed its speed. Here is what should stop you, because this knowledge did not vanish for any good reason. The pressurized cooling system is not new and not a mystery. Car makers understood the benefit of pressurizing the coolant as far back as the 1940s, And every trick on this list was ordinary teachable craft in 1958, known to any competent mechanic in any town. What changed was not the physics, it was the shop. Cooling systems became sealed and watched over by a sensor feeding a computer. Parts became things you replaced rather than tested, and a generation of technicians learned to read a code on a screen instead of a fever with a hand. The heat still moves the way it always did, by the same plain laws. But the man who could lay a palm on a radiator and map a clog aged out while the trade forgot it had ever needed him. The knowledge is not gone because it stopped being true. It is gone because no one was taught to keep it. Number 14, checking the pressure cap, the few pounds that lifted the boiling point. You tested the radiator cap because that small spring-loaded lid did far more than hold the coolant in. By sealing the system and holding pressure, it raised the temperature at which the coolant would boil, and a cap that had lost its spring or seal let the whole system boil over far too soon, a dollar part causing chronic overheating in a car whose radiator and fan were sound. A mechanic in 1958 suspected the cap early because a system's boiling point rises about 3 degrees for every pound the cap holds. So a 15-pound cap lifts a proper mix from roughly 220 degrees to 265, and a failed one lets it boil far too soon. The needles mechanic kept spare caps on a nail and changed them like spark plugs. The cap looked like nothing. It was holding back 45 degrees. Number 13, getting the coolant mix right, the balance that carried the most heat. You mixed the coolant to roughly half antifreeze and half water, and no richer because more was not better. The antifreeze gave freeze protection, rust protection, and a higher boiling point, but the water carried the heat, and a mix run too strong shed heat worse and ran hotter, not cooler. A mechanic in 1958 mixed the coolant carefully because water transfers heat better than antifreeze, so an overly rich mix runs hotter. And the man who dumped in straight antifreeze thinking more was safer had cooked his own engine. The needles mechanic mixed for the desert, leaning on clean water in that furnace summer. More antifreeze felt safer. In the heat, it was worse. Number 12, using clean, soft water, keeping the scale off the metal. When you filled a system, you used clean, soft water, rainwater or distilled, never the hard mineral water from a desert tap. Hard water leaves scale, a chalky crust that plates the block and the radiator tubes and insulates the very metal meant to be shedding heat, silting a system over years as surely as rust did. A mechanic in 1958 filled with soft water because minerals in hard water leave scale that coats the passages and insulates the metal, and he had cut open enough scaled blocks to know what desert tap water left behind. The needles mechanic caught rainwater when he could and bought distilled when he could not. The water looked clean going in. The scale it left was the slow killer. Number 11, burping the trapped air, chasing the pocket that made no sense. After any drain, refill, or hose job, you burped the system, working the trapped air out through the high point until coolant filled every passage solid. A pocket lodged against the thermostat or up in the head made an engine overheat for no reason a man could see, the gauge climbing while the radiator sat half cool. A mechanic in 1958 burped a system slowly and completely because trapped air blocks coolant flow and carries no heat itself, so a pocket near the thermostat or head causes sudden overheating even when everything else is sound. The needles mechanic ran an engine with the cap off and watched the air belch out before he called it done. The engine boiled with a radiator half cold. The trouble was a pocket of nothing. Number 10. Leaving the thermostat in. The summer fix that made it worse. You left the thermostat in, even in the killing heat of a desert summer, and talked customers out of the trick half the country swore by, yanking it out to run cooler. It did the opposite. With the thermostat gone, the coolant raced through the radiator too fast to give up its heat, and in slow traffic the engine ran hotter, not cooler. A mechanic in 1958 knew the pulled thermostat trick was a myth, because coolant needs time in the radiator to shed its heat. So, with nothing to regulate the flow, it races through too fast to cool, and cars came back running hotter, not cooler. The Needles mechanic put the thermostat back in and sent the myth out the door. Pulling it felt like freeing the flow. It was starving the cooling. Number 9. Watching the filler neck for bubbles, the breath of a failing head gasket. With the cap off and the engine warm, you watched the coolant in the filler neck for bubbles. A little movement was normal. A constant, insistent bubbling was combustion gas leaking past a failing head gasket, pushing exhaust into the cooling system telling you the trouble was no longer in the cooling system at all. A mechanic in 1958 watched for those bubbles because combustion gases forced past a failed head gasket enter the coolant and rise as a persistent stream while raising the pressure, turning an overheating puzzle into a clear answer, a breach between the fire and the water. The Needles mechanic read the bubbles and knew the job had grown from a flush to a gasket. The radiator was fine. The engine was breathing into its own coolant. Number 8. Guarding the fan shroud. The airflow the fan could not make alone. You kept the fan shroud in place, that unglamorous ring of metal around the fan, because without it, the fan pulled air from wherever was easiest instead of through the core. At speed, the wind pushed air through on its own, but at idle and in crawling traffic, exactly when a desert engine was likeliest to boil, the shroud was all the airflow there was. A mechanic in 1958 never left a shroud off because it channels the fan's pull through the core rather than around it. So its absence lets the fan draw air from the sides and starves the core at idle, where overheating in traffic so often began. The Needles mechanic treated the shroud as part of the fan, never optional trim. The fan spun either way. Only the shroud made it cool. Here is the part of his story worth telling. The Needles mechanic did not teach himself. He came up under an old desert hand who had cured boiled engines since the Model T crossed that country. A man who would not let the boy touch a wrench on a hot car for a whole summer, only watch and lay his hand where the old man's had been. "It is all one thing," the old man told him. "It is heat trying to get out and something stopping it. Find the something." He made the boy trace the whole path with his hands, from the block to the hoses, to the core, to the air, until the boy could feel the heat move and feel where it stalled. Then one day a car came in boiling that had beaten 2 other shops, and the boy laid his palm on the radiator, found the cold spot, and named the clog before the old man could. The old man just nodded. That secret is number 1 on this list. Number 7. Reading the water pump, the belt and the weep hole. You checked the water pump 2 ways, the belt and the weep hole. A loose glazed belt let the pulley slip at idle, so the pump turned slower than the engine and moved less coolant exactly when it ran hottest. And a stain or drip at the little weep hole meant the seal was failing and the pump was on its way out. A mechanic in 1958 checked the belt tension and the weep hole together because the pump drives all circulation, and one that cannot move coolant from a slipping belt or a weeping seal breaks the most important link in the chain. The needle's mechanic set a belt by feel, firm but not straining, every time. A dead pump made every other part innocent. Nothing mattered if the coolant would not move. Number 6. Diagnosing by when it overheated. The timing that named the fault. Before he touched anything, you asked one question: when does it overheat? One that ran hot in traffic but cooled at speed had an AIR flow problem, a fan, a shroud, a clogged core face, or low coolant. One that ran cool in town but boiled on the highway had a flow problem, a weak pump, a restricted radiator, a bad mix, or a breach. The pattern told you which half to search. A mechanic in 1958 always asked when it happened because overheating at idle points to airflow faults, while overheating at speed points to flow or heat transfer faults. So the condition narrowed the diagnosis before a single part was touched. The needle's mechanic listened to the driver and had the fault half found before he opened the hood. When it boiled, told him where to look. Half the diagnosis was in the question. Number 5. Cleaning the face of the core. The airflow choked by what it caught. You cleaned the outside of the radiator, the face of the core, of the bugs, the cottonwood fluff, the grit and desert grime that packed between the fins and blocked the air. A radiator can be clear inside and still overheat if its face is matted shut, the air unable to reach the fins, and in cottonwood season, the fluff could blind a core in an afternoon. A mechanic in 1958 hosed and brushed the core face clean because a radiator sheds heat only when air passes through its fins, so debris matted against the face chokes it as surely as an inside clog. The needle's mechanic blew a core clean from the engine side, back the way the bugs came. Inside, clear. Outside, blind. The heat had nowhere to go. Number 4. Reading the tune behind the heat, the fire that ran too hot to start with. Sometimes the cooling system was innocent, and you looked at the tune because an engine's own settings could make it run hot before the coolant had a chance. Timing set too late, and a mixture run too lean both burned hotter than they should. An engine like that was not failing to shed its heat. It was making far too much, and no radiator on Earth could keep up. A mechanic in 1958 checked the timing and mixture on a stubborn overheater because late timing and a lean mixture both raise combustion temperature. So a mistuned engine runs hot regardless of the cooling system, outproducing a perfect radiator. The needle's mechanic set the timing right and watched the fever break with no cooling part touched. The radiator was blameless. The fire itself was running too hot. Number 3. Pressure testing for the slow leak. Hunting the loss that starved it dry. You pumped the system up with a pressure tester and watched the gauge, because a system that could not hold pressure was losing coolant somewhere, and low coolant was low heat, moving capacity. A slow leak at a hose, a seep at the pump, a weeping freeze plug, a hairline in the core, any of them would bleed a system down over days until it ran short and boiled, and the pressure tester found the loss the eye would miss. The needle's mechanic pressure tested any engine that boiled without an obvious cause, because a system that will not hold pressure is losing coolant, and low coolant cannot move heat. He had seen desperate drivers try the old roadside tricks, a spoonful of pepper or a raw egg poured into the radiator to swell and plug a weeping leak long enough to limp somewhere, and he understood those for what they were, a way to reach the next town. Never a repair. The real cure was to find the hole and close it. He found the leak, closed it, and pressure tested again before he trusted it. Number 2. Reading where the heat stalled. The hand that traced the whole chain. Before he replaced a single part, you traced the entire path of the heat with your hands and your eyes, from the block to the upper hose, to the core, to the lower hose and back, feeling for exactly where the heat arrived and where it stopped. Overheating was never random. The heat moved along its chain until it hit the broken link and piled up there, and the place it stalled was the place the fault lived. The needle's mechanic ran his hands down the whole cooling path like a man following a river to the dam, and wherever the heat quit moving, that was where he dug in. He did not guess and swap parts hoping to get lucky. Because heat moves through the system in a fixed path, the point where it stops advancing marks the fault. Everything downstream of it cold and everything upstream cooking. He read the chain until he found the broken link, and then he fixed that, and only that. Number 1. Keeping the heat moving, the one law under all the rest. Here it is, the secret every other trick on this list is only a piece of. An engine does not overheat because it makes too much heat. It overheats because it fails to move the heat it makes. The fire in the cylinders makes the same heat it always did, and the cooling system's one job is to carry that heat out of the engine and hand it to the air. Coolant flowing, air flowing, pressure holding. Every fault, every trick, every fever comes down to a single question: where did the heat stop moving? The needle's mechanic knew this in his hands before he could have put it in words, because the old desert man had drilled it into him one boiled engine at a time. Find the something that stopped the heat, he would say, and you have found the fault. A clogged core, a stuck thermostat, a slipping pump, a dead cap, an air pocket, a blocked face. They were all the same thing, wearing different clothes, a break in the chain that moved the heat. That is why a real cooling man never threw parts at a hot engine. He found where the heat had stalled, because the heat always tells you if you have the hands to feel it. Number 1 was never a part or a tool. It was a way of seeing an engine as a system for moving heat, and knowing that to cure the fever, you had only to find where the heat stopped and set it moving again. None of these tricks was magic. They were a flat hand, a garden hose, a pan of hot water, a pressure tester, and a man who understood that a cooling system has one job: to move heat, and that every fever is that movement stopped somewhere along the chain. He read radiators with his palm, boiled thermostats on the bench, and cured engines that had beaten every shop for 100 miles. A few dollars of parts and an hour of real diagnosis sent a family back onto that blazing highway with an engine that ran cool and true. Here is what aches about it. None of this was ever secret or unexplainable. Every trick obeyed plain, teachable laws that carmakers understood before these mechanics were born, and any good shop in 1958 knew them all. What we lost was not the science. It was the hand that could feel it. As cooling systems sealed themselves up and sensors and screens took over the reading of them, the craft of laying a palm on a radiator and mapping the trouble simply stopped being passed down until a whole trade that once diagnosed a fever by touch learned to wait for a code instead. We did not lose these tricks because engines stopped overheating in the heat. Every engine still runs on the same law: heat made in the fire and carried out to the air, and it still fails the same way, at whatever link gives out first. What we lost was the reader, the one who could stand before a boiling engine in 120-degree heat, lay his hands on it, and know in a moment where the heat had stopped. We lost the old desert man in Needles who would not let a boy touch a hot car for a summer, and the boy who learned to feel the heat move and feel it stall. He cooled that furnace town's engines for 30 years, until the cars came in sealed and computer-watched and no longer needed a man who could read them by hand. And on his last hot afternoon, he took a young man's palm and laid it flat against a radiator, and told him to feel for the place the heat had stopped.